I'm Laurah Norton, and this is One Strange Thing, the show where we search the nation's news archives for stories that can't quite be explained. Strangers, it's June, and we can't help but think, well, summery kinds of thoughts. These humid memories, they naturally evoke Florida, which then, of course, reminds us of a certain stink. We are not suggesting that the state itself is malodorous. In fact, some of our very favorite people who definitely do not stink hail from the Sunshine State. Melissa and Mandy from Moms and Mysteries, Ariana Grande, Flo Rida, the list goes on. No, when our sensory memory tingles at the thought of Florida, it's because one of our favorite cryptids has entered the chat. The Skunk Ape, Lord of the Swamps, Bigfoot of the Bayous, Emperor of the Everglades. We can honestly do this all day. If Skunk Ape isn't Florida's favorite paranormal son, then we're willing to pull up stakes and turn in our expert cards at the door. According to a News 6 poll, that's a Florida station, 29% of their viewers believe that they'd personally seen a skunk ape. And maybe that's not so surprising. After all, skunk ape expert Dave Shealy says that the cryptid is spotted all over the state. He reports that spots like Myakka State Park and Ocala National Forest are most common, but they aren't, quote, the only locations. Per Atlas Obscura, quote, Shealy insists that there are 7 to 9 skunk apes currently living in the Everglades, and he's been working tirelessly to document their existence. That's where his skunk ape research headquarters are located, and where, according to the Smithsonian, quote, he bills himself as the Jane Goodall of skunk apes. And what, you may ask, does a skunk ape research headquarters do? Well, they track signs of the cryptid, of course. And Dave is committed to that. According to the Smithsonian, he spotted his first skunk ape all the way back in 1974, when he was just a child. And he's been on the hunt ever since. The hunt for knowledge, that is. Dave Shealy says he is solely focused on skunk ape preservation, not on its capture. Which can be difficult when you can't technically prove that something exists. But per Atlas Obscura, he routinely warns anyone who spots a creature to wait days to report it to authorities. That way, the ape has time to move on. Anyway, although the skunk ape is associated with Florida, it's not so different from other primate-type cryptids that we've covered in the past. A Bigfoot variant, if you like, but maybe just a little funkier. And like most Sasquatch creatures reported across the country, the skunk ape has a few key features to its legend. Some oral history that might predate settlers to North America, a sharp increase in sightings in the 1970s when Bigfoot fever hit the U.S., and the usual characteristics, broadly speaking. And what are those characteristics? Well, according to Atlas Obscura, that'd be that, quote, an average male skunk ape reportedly stands 6 to 7 feet tall and weighs roughly 400 pounds. They note that females are smaller and that, quote, both sexes are covered in long reddish or black hair, similar to that of an orangutan or gorilla, and stand upright on 2 legs. And at the risk of driving this point home, it's not even necessarily unique that they're smelly. We've covered a number of primate cryptids that were described as such. It's more that the skunk ape is the worst of the lot. As an expert quoted in the Northport Sun explained, they smell really, really, really bad. In all the reports, the first thing people notice is a really bad odor that smells like a skunk, or some say a really wet dog, rotting meat. And the Tampa Bay Times reported that, quote, close encounters in the 70s report stench of rotten eggs, cooked cabbage, or moldy cheese. Now, the question that we have is, why? Honestly, it all feels a little excessive. But despite our research, the internet has not been exactly teeming with great theories. Eating skunks, having bad BO, and not bathing, do cryptids even bathe? All of that seems a little iffy. The best option we saw was mentioned by a columnist for the lineup, that the smell, quote, is most likely caused by their preference for hiding out in alligator dens polluted by swamp gas and other murky areas often surrounded by animal carcasses. Isn't learning fun? Now, we said that the skunk ape was popularized in the 1970s, both in number of sightings and in the cultural imagination. As we've discussed before, the 1967 Patterson-Gimlin film of a creature walking in the woods, it really kicked off Bigfooty things. That and the interest of serious scientists in the late 1960s. By the mid-70s, the FBI was even involved. As movie blogger John Muir points out, there were at least 5 Bigfoot movies and many popular TV shows featuring the cryptid that were made that decade. Not to mention a certain Wookiee with a very Sasquatch air about him. Per Weird US, sightings were so numerous in Florida in the 1970s that a bill was proposed to offer skunk apes some form of wildlife protection. Now, House Bill 1664 did not pass. Sorry to break that to you, but it was interesting. In part, it stated, any person taking, possessing, harming, or molesting any anthropoid or humanoid animal which is native to Florida, popularly known as the skunk ape, or doing any act reasonably capable of harming or molesting such animals, those acts would be a misdemeanor. This was, according to then State Representative Paul Nuckols, because he was worried about what would happen if someone actually caught a cryptid. Per Weird US, the rep said, I'd hate to see someone catch one and put it in a circus or a zoo. But why were so many people, including apparently state representatives, utterly convinced that skunk apes were roaming Florida? Was it simply the Bigfoot zeitgeist of the 70s, or was there something more going on? Well, strangers, it won't surprise you to hear that we dug in to find out. So, as is the case with many other ape cryptids, there are layers here, but the research is a little stickier than usual. A lot of the books and articles we came across reference Muskegee and Seminole oral history as support for the skunk ape's existence. That is open to a lot of interpretation. But what gets people really excited are some fascinating stories out there about the work of a group of paranormal investigators. According to numerous reports, they were called the Southernmost Skunk Ape Society, and they came upon some documentation in an attic that would place cryptid sightings in what is now Florida to at least the 15th century. Some of the historic events tied to their research, it's even made it into online sources for the skunk ape, onto blogs, and into modern articles. This kind of documentation would be pretty exciting for our show, since we're usually dealing with a lot less than that. It would be exciting. Except for one strange thing. Unfortunately for anyone who truly enjoys a good plot, no discovery was actually made. And there is no Southernmost Skunk Ape Society. It all comes straight from a work of historical fiction by a man named Brad Bertelli. He wrote a book, The Skunk Ape Files, back in 2021, and though he included some real sightings in this work, some of the lore he created for his book, it's worked its way into the historical record, like the completely imaginary society and the investigative work it did in the 1970s to make discoveries about the skunk ape. So, even when doing research, we have to double-check to make sure that a well-meaning blogger hasn't confused Brad's fictional account for an actual sighting. Brad told the Florida Keys Free Press that he was inspired to write his tale after reading about an extremely intense series of real reported skunk ape encounters in the, you guessed it, 1970s, but that his work was apparently so convincing that now people contact him to report real sightings. More than that, he, quote, frequently gets people contacting him about the society, which, naturally, they want to join. Even with that confusion in the mix, though, we are able to trace our skunky pal in the newspapers and the periodicals. We found multiple references, including one in Smithsonian Magazine, to 2 early sightings, one in 1942 and another in 1957. That 1942 sighting was described in a few different ways, but most sources generally say that a skunk ape-like creature actually grabbed onto some unlucky soul's car. This was over in Suwannee County, and took a free ride down the road. This is one of those stories that's largely retold versus given a real citation. We haven't been able to track down any original reporting on it, though we'd love to see a clipping if it does exist. The 1957 sighting, that's reputed to involve 3 hunters who had an encounter deep in what is now the Big Cypress National Preserve. The trouble is that we can't find that one either, just the references. But that doesn't mean that people didn't know about the skunk ape. In the oldest article in our archives, from 1971, its name was already an established fact. And it seems like folks have been discussing the creature for a long time. In an AP article from the Pensacola News, it was reported that members of a state archaeological society had headed into the Big Cypress Swamp to investigate skunk ape sightings. Apparently, the team had decided to investigate after one member, H.C. Osborne, saw, quote, a 7-foot, 700-pound creature the previous February. This was, by the by, just a few years before the swamp became a national preserve. Anyway, H.C. said that his team had heard rumors of the beast in the swamp, quote, for years, but that he hadn't paid much attention, not until they'd been out on a dig the previous winter, and they'd had their own encounter. He recalled that it was around 3 a.m. when, quote, we heard something moving outside the tent. We went out and it was just looking at us. H.C. said that before they could decide what to do, the creature fled, but it left tracks behind. The archaeologists spotted them the next day, and they made casts that were nearly 18 inches long. But that's not all. Later on, they spotted, quote, smaller tracks, which indicated to H.C. that multiple apes must be moving through the area. He also told the paper that locals said fishermen had long known about the skunk ape, at least since the 1920s, and had carried back reports of its god-awful stench. As the Pensacola News points out, the Big Cypress covers, quote, hundreds of thousands of acres. And in 1971, many areas of the swampland were still, quote, virtually terra incognita. H.B. Osborne told the paper that his team had been hesitant to discuss their investigation. After all, they were academics, but had some initial thoughts that they hoped to share with other scientists. We think the skunk ape lives mainly on conch and small lobster. I'm also guessing it lives in caves, although we haven't heard of any caves being found in the Big Cypress. That said, it should be noted that others, like the chief photographer for the Central and South Florida Flood Control District, didn't necessarily buy into the archaeologist's theory. Just days after the first article, the photographer, Earl Deemer, told the Miami News that he suspected the group probably had just seen a black bear. Deemer, a member of the Seminole tribe and its former chairman, said, I've never heard of anything like it in our legends. I've lived out there in the Big Cypress off and on for a long time, and I've never heard of any Indian talking about any ape man. According to the Naples Daily News, those 1971 reports of H.C.'s group and their quest set off skunk ape sightings, quote, all over Florida. And some officials expressed concern that a prankster might catch a bullet in his hairy ape suit since armed posses were combing the woods. But that didn't happen, and new different encounters kept on coming. Like we mentioned at the top, once the 1970s kicked off, the newspapers are practically a skunk ape smorgasbord of sightings. If we told you about every report, we'd become a Florida-only podcast, which honestly would be doable considering the wealth of material, but we should discuss a few of the more notable encounters. In 1973, the Fort Lauderdale News reported that a skunk ape was blamed for a grisly attack on a Broward County farm where at least one cow was slain and other animals were injured. Why was a skunk ape blamed? Well, a giant footprint was found in the dirt not far away from the farm's fence. And then in 1974, the Palm Beach Post went pretty far in the other direction. It ran a story titled, "Save the Skunk Ape." In this article, readers were told of reports that, quote, an Everglades skunk ape was struck by a motorist on US 27. In the article, the Florida Highway State Patrol described this creature as, quote, huge, 7 or 8 feet tall and human-like. Now, the Palm Beach Post was perhaps not taking this report fully seriously, as it suggested that the skunk ape may be, quote, Florida's rarest and most endangered species. But the real fervor, it kicked off in 1977. That's actually what inspired Brad Bertelli, the author whose historical Skunk Ape book has confused so many with its imagined society and its secret papers. But Brad did come upon a real set of news clippings, from his own newspaper, in fact. Brad was a columnist for The Reporter, which extensively covered the travails of the Steckman family of Key Largo. Apparently, their story wasn't just covered in The Reporter, it also popped up in the St. Pete Times and the Palm Beach Post. Now, we've seen their experience described as both starting in August and as beginning in July. Either way, we can safely say that the Steckmans did not have a hot girl summer. According to the Florida Key News, the Steckmans, Charles, Leslie, and their 3 children, had lived quietly in Key Largo, where Charles worked as a cabinet maker. Per the news, he'd also worked as a police officer and was a veteran, so we expect that Charles had seen some things in his time. But perhaps nothing like what he and his son Charlie encountered while, quote, hunting for rare bottles among the mangroves growing behind their home. That's when, per the Florida Key News, they saw something hairy, hulking in the distance. Charles recalled, I think I startled it. It was way ahead, a dark, hairy patch. It sort of stayed there, like a deer does when the wind shifts and catches your scent. But it stunk awful, like a dog that hasn't been bathed in a year and suddenly gets rained on. Per the Florida Keys Free Press, Charles estimated that the creature was 9 feet in height and at least 500 pounds and had long fur. And apparently, it made a rather awful noise, like a high-pitched kind of caterwauling. We can't imagine it was worse than the stink, though. Charles' initial reaction was not to panic, it seems, because he spent the next day clearing all of the brush from his backyard. It doesn't say explicitly why in any of the news sources, but we have to assume that he thought that the creature was hanging out there because of the convenient cover. In any case, it didn't help. Per the Florida Key News, a neighbor spotted the skunk ape lurking behind Charles's shed soon after. Only then did Charles call the police, and they weren't able to find a thing. However, that doesn't mean they wrote the family off. Sergeant Chen of the sheriff's office told reporters at the time, there's definitely a problem here. These people are truly scared to death. It's unlikely that someone's pulling a practical joke because it would require a great deal of effort. If this is a joke, someone's liable to get hurt. And for the Steckman family, things didn't let up. In fact, Leslie, Charles's wife, was awakened one night by a sighting of her own. According to the Florida Key News, she recalled that she, quote, could hear limbs snapping and breaking as if something big was walking through them. Through a gap in the jalousie window from where I was lying in bed, I saw these bright, colorless eyes. They must have been reflecting the backyard light, like a cat's would. They were evil, staring. I could see the silhouette of its huge shoulder and head above an 8-foot bush, 30 feet from the bedroom window. And apparently, that was enough for Leslie. Per the Key West Citizen, she packed up the kids and left for the safety of, we imagine, anywhere without a skunk ape. Charles remained behind for some time, but he couldn't flush out the creature. And per the Citizen, the story, quote, ends inconclusively. The final story from the Reporter's archives said that 4 men were going to search the area from Harry Harris Park to the Dove Creek in a safari to search for skunk ape. The Citizen explained that, quote, readers were encouraged to read the next edition about their findings, but no story can be found about skunk apes after that. The Florida Key News wrote that there was some evidence collected at the time, but that, quote, nothing concrete seems to have survived. There was a picture taken at night, some plaster footprint cast collected by Florida Technical Institute to study the scene, and that sort of thing. Those were reported to have been, quote, 14 and 15 inches in length, respectively. Of course, this encounter, while perhaps the most famous of the era, was not the last. According to Dave Shealy, the self-described Skunk Ape Jane Goodall, there have sometimes been as many as 250 sightings in a year. And with merchandise and movies and books and the advent of the internet, the cryptid's legend has only grown. And while the most common skeptical response is, "You saw a bear," mixed with a healthy dose of, "That was a guy in a suit," the true believers are still out there. The scientists who tramped through those swamps, the legislators, the Dave Shealys and the Steckmans, they believe in a different and stinkier truth. That Skunk Ape is out there, trudging through the swamps, totally disregarding the effect that humidity will have on its fur right now. And, perhaps, if we're lucky, forever. We hope you'll join us next time for another real-life story from the fine print of America's local papers, from the lives of regular people, just like you and me, except for one strange thing. Strangers. I've released my first book, and it's available everywhere now as an audiobook, a hardcover, and an ebook. I read the audio version myself. It's called Lay Them to Rest. It's about John and Jane Doe's, my years-long experience following forensic experts around the country, and our efforts to solve the mystery of a cold case. One Strange Thing is an independent podcast. To support the show and to hear more of the entirely true and the enticingly peculiar, you now have 3 options to enjoy 2 extra bonus episodes a month. On Apple Premium and Supercast, you can get the bonus episodes delivered to your app of choice for just $2.99. And for $2 more a month on Patreon, you'll get more fun extras. There you'll find ad-free early releases of our regular episodes, 2 full-length bonus episodes, monthly giveaways, blog posts, and occasional live streams, all for $5 a month. We hope you'll check out one of these options and support the show. There's a link in our show notes. And if you enjoy One Strange Thing, please take a moment to leave us a great rating or review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps.